Sagebrush Wells, Oregon, February 1887, the morning that was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Snow driving sideways, wedding dress already caked in mud. And the man she was about to marry, standing in front of her, no wedding coat, voice unsteady. "Marin, I can't do this." She didn't beg. She didn't break. She walked straight out in front of the whole town. A man in the crowd said it like it was just the weather. "You can't run a ranch alone." Marin stood tall, gray-green eyes cold and level. Then a stranger stepped out of the shadow's patched coat, trail dust on his hat, eyes not on the crowd but fixed on her. "Maybe she doesn't have to. I'll stay provided. Miss Holt is the one asking." "Who is he? What does he want? And why does the name Holt make a drifting cowboy stop dead in his tracks?" This is Marin and Rafe's story, and you won't want to miss a single chapter. The snow came in sideways that morning. Marin stood in the church vestibule and watched it through the narrow window beside the door. She had been watching for 20 minutes. The flakes were wet and heavy, the kind that stuck to everything and made the world look soft when it wasn't. She smoothed the front of her dress for the 4th time. Cream wool. Practical enough for a February wedding, her aunt had said when they ordered the cloth. She wore her father's old ranch coat over it because the vestibule had no heat, and her hands had already gone stiff. The red ribbon from her bonnet hung loose at her wrist. She'd meant to retie it. Calvin came through the side door without his wedding coat. She knew before he opened his mouth. She'd known, maybe, since he stopped meeting her eyes at supper the night before. But she had sewn those buttons herself, and sometimes you keep moving forward because stopping feels worse than whatever's coming. Marin. He held his hat in both hands and turned the brim in a slow circle. "I can't do this." She waited. "The horses," he said. "The association is saying there's illness out at your place. Contagious, maybe. If I tie my family's name to that, my father's routes, my brother's." He stopped, turned the hat again. "Merritt says if I go through with this, he'll close every freight lane the Rusks depend on." Merritt, of course. "You spoke with Merritt Voss," she said. "Not a question. He came to me last night, and you went." Calvin's jaw moved. "Marin, I care about you. I do, but I've got 4 brothers and a father who can't." "Don't," she said it quietly. "Don't tell me about your father." She picked up her skirt, walked to the main door, and pushed it open before the congregation could be told a gentler lie. The cold hit her full in the face. People were gathered on the church steps and down into the street. The way people gather when they sense something is about to go wrong. 40 or 50 of them, wrapped in their good coats, breath rising in small clouds. She recognized every face. She had known most of them her whole life. Calvin appeared behind her. He said the words. She didn't listen to the exact shape of them. She watched a woman near the back of the crowd lean toward her husband and whisper. Merritt Voss stood to the left of the steps. He was a big man, broad across the chest with silver hair and the kind of careful expression that looked like concern. He wore it well. He'd had years of practice, Miss Holt. He stepped forward with his hat over his heart. "I'm truly sorry. I know this isn't what any of us wanted. But the association has an obligation to protect the whole basin, and with the situation at your ranch being what it is." "What situation is that?" she asked. "The illness, ma'am, in your herd. You understand we can't risk the spread." Around her, the crowd shifted. She could feel them deciding things. She could feel the weight of it, the particular silence that settles when people have already made up their minds and are only waiting to see what the woman does next. Someone said it then. She didn't catch who. The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Male, not even cruel about it, just certain. "You can't run a ranch alone." A few people looked at the ground. A few nodded. Then a man near the livery post called out something worse. He said, "Reject bride," with a little laugh attached, and 2 or 3 others picked it up, and that was the sound of it, not shouting, not meanness exactly, just the low, comfortable noise of people who thought they already knew the end of the story. Marin reached up and pulled the red ribbon from her bonnet. She didn't throw it. She didn't make a scene. She folded it once and pressed it into her coat pocket, and she looked at Calvin, who was staring at his boots, and she decided that was enough of that. She came down the steps. The crowd parted a little. That's when she noticed the man by the water trough. He wasn't from Sagebrush Wells. She was sure of that. He stood at the edge of things, one shoulder against the hitching post, arms loose at his sides. Tall, lean, dark hat with trail dust still on the brim. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching Merritt. When her eyes found him, his found her. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. Slow, steady. He moved the way a man moves when he's in no hurry, but won't be stopped either. Miss Holt. His voice was low even. Rafe called her. I came in with the freight wagon this morning. I don't know you, she said. No. He glanced at Merritt, then back to her. But I know that man, and I know what he does to ranches he wants. Merritt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Maybe you won't have to do it alone, Calder said. I'll stay through the spring work, provided you're the one asking. The crowd had gone quiet. Marin looked at him. His coat was patched at both elbows. His gloves had been repaired so many times, the leather was a patchwork of different browns. His hands were still. He wasn't performing anything for the crowd. He wasn't looking at them at all. You're offering ranch labor, she said. Yes, ma'am. Based on a conversation you just heard. Based on what I've seen this morning. He paused. You're the one who has to say yes, not them. She was about to answer him. She wasn't sure what she would have said when Solstice went down. The lead mare had been tied at the hitching rail. Marin had brought her because Solstice was steady in crowds, because having her close felt like something solid when everything else wasn't. Now, the mare's front legs buckled, and she dropped to the mud with a sound like something giving up. Her sides heaved, her nostrils flared wide and dark. Marin was moving before she thought about it. She went to her knees in the mud beside Solstice, coat and dress and all, and put her hands on the mare's neck. The crowd stepped back. Calvin called something. She ignored it. She ran her hand down the mare's jaw, opened her mouth gently, checked the tongue. Dark residue on the underside. Not blood. Something powdery, dried into a dark paste. This wasn't illness. She sat back on her heels and tried to think through the noise of the crowd and the wind. The symptoms didn't fit. The progression was wrong. Merritt had been so certain, so quick with his explanation, and she hadn't been able to argue without evidence. She had evidence now. Rafe Calder crouched down across from her, not close enough to crowd her. He held the mare's halter loose in one hand, keeping the animal calm without taking the reins from Marin. Under the tongue, Marin said. I see it. He leaned forward, sniffed once near the mare's mouth. Something crossed his face. He recognized it. She was certain of it. But he said nothing about how he knew. She needs to be moved, Marin said. Away from here. Away from the other horses until I figure out what this is. Tell me how you want to do it. It was such a simple answer she noticed it. She looked up at him. He was waiting. Nothing more. There are conditions, she said. There ought to be. She kept her voice low, steady. The crowd was still there, still watching. Let them watch. Bunkhouse. Wages paid regardless of what I have to sell to manage it. No claim on the property. No decisions made about my herd without my say. Either of us can end the arrangement. 7 days, he said. To start. You can send me off at the end of them. I can send you off before the end of them. Yes, ma'am. Mud covered her knees and the hem of her dress. She didn't look down at it. Then get her up, she said, carefully. I'll bring the wagon around. She walked past Merritt without looking at him. She heard him say something to a man beside him, his voice too low to catch. She kept walking. Behind her, Rafe Calder spoke quietly to Solstice and began working the mare back to her feet. They reached Holt Ranch after dark. The road was frozen mud and patches of old snow, and the wind had picked up until it cut through the wagon canvas. Marin drove. Rafe rode alongside without comment. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought about the look on Calvin's face when he held that hat. She thought about the ribbon in her pocket. She didn't cry. There wasn't anything wrong with crying, but she wasn't built that way, not in front of roads and dark and strangers. When they came over the last rise, she saw the eastern pasture. Every horse was crowded against the fence, all of them pressed together the way animals press when something frightens them, and there's nowhere to go. She counted shapes in the dark, and her stomach dropped. She handed Rafe the reins and climbed down before he could speak. The feed shed door stood open. Inside, the same bitter smell, the same dark dust scattered across the floor, across the hay, across the water pan in the corner. The mineral cake, if that's what it was, had been spread deliberately, carefully, across every surface where a horse might find it. And in the mud outside the shed door, clear even in lantern light, a fresh boot print, leading away from the shed. Toward the house, Marin went through the front door first, rifle up, moving room to room while Rafe circled behind the barn. She checked the kitchen, the back bedroom, her father's old study. Nothing disturbed except the desk. The middle drawer had been forced, the lock tongue bent sideways, the wood around it splintered fresh. She stood in front of it for a moment without touching anything. Her father's papers were still inside, his breeding ledger, his land survey, but she knew his desk the way she knew her own hands, and something was wrong with the order of things. Papers that had been on the left were on the right. The bottom stack had been lifted and replaced in a hurry. Rafe came through the back door quietly enough that she heard the latch before his boots. No tracks on the far side except the one set heading east, he said. Whoever it was, they didn't linger. They went through his desk. Rafe looked at the drawer. He didn't touch it either. What was in there? Everything. She paused. Or what was left of everything. He had records going back 15 years. Breeding notes, feed contracts, bills of sale. She pushed the drawer closed with 2 fingers. I'll go through it in the morning. Right now, the horses need attention. They worked through the night. Marin mixed a wash of clean water and dried herbs from the shelf above the stove. Her father's remedy, the one her mother had taught him, which he had taught her. She went stall to stall with it, while Rafe hauled clean water from the south pump, which ran from a different source than the main trough. 4 mares were showing symptoms: rolling eyes, dry lips, unsteady on their feet. 2 of the younger ones kept pressing their heads against the fence rails, which meant the headache had started. She talked to each horse while she worked, not explaining herself, not performing calm, just talking the way you talk to someone who can't answer back but is listening anyway. Rafe noticed. He didn't say anything about it. By 2 in the morning, 3 of the 4 mares were standing steadier. The 4th, a gray named Pepper, was still worrying Marin. She pulled up a 3-legged stool and sat with the mare, and didn't leave until the animal's breathing slowed into something regular. Rafe had fixed the feed shed lock by then. He'd also nailed a board across the splintered section of the east fence, which had nothing to do with the horses but needed doing, and he'd done it without being asked. He showed up at the barn door around 3 with 2 tin cups. Coffee, he said. She took one. They stood in the cold barn doorway and drank. The conditions still stand, she said. In case you're wondering, I wasn't wondering. Bunkhouse. I know, he finished his coffee. The stove in there needs a new gasket. I'll manage. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the pasture, his eyes moving across the fence line in a slow sweep, the way you scan when you're checking for something you hope isn't there. 7 days, she said. 7 days. Morning came gray and cold. Thomas Alvarez arrived just after sunrise, which surprised her. He'd left 3 weeks ago, right before her father's funeral. Right after Merritt's men came by with their warning. She'd understood it, even as it hurt. Thomas had a mother and 2 younger sisters in town. He wasn't a man who could afford to be blacklisted. He pulled his horse up short when he saw Rafe in the yard. Marin stepped out. He's hired. Tomas climbed down slowly, and she watched him look at Rafe, with the particular measuring look that men use when they're deciding something. Rafe looked back without flinching and without any particular display. Tomas Alvarez, Tomas said. Rafe called her. They shook hands once. Tomas turned to Marin. I can't stay. He had his hat in his hand and he was holding it tight. They came to the house last night, one of Merritt's men. He told my mother that any hand who worked for Holt Ranch would be finished in the basin. No association sales, no freight contracts. Nothing I know, Marin said. He meant it. I know he did, Thomas exhaled. His breath was heavy in the cold air. I came to tell you in person because you deserved that. And because he stopped. He glanced at Rafe again, then back at her. Because I found something. 2 nights ago, I was cutting through the freight yard and I saw fresh wagon tracks coming out from behind the Rusk loading bay. Late. After midnight. Narrow rims? Rafe asked. Tomas looked at him. You know these tracks? I've been seeing them since yesterday. Show me. They went out to the north edge of the property together. In the cold morning mud, the tracks were still clear. Narrow-rimmed freight wheels with a specific spacing, and one of the rear wheels had a hairline split in the iron that left a faint, doubled line on the right side. Marin crouched down. She had seen the Rusk freight wagons her whole life. She knew their wheel pattern. That's a Rusk wagon, she said. Rafe said nothing. She stood up. Calvin didn't know. She said it partly to herself, or he didn't want to know. There's a difference. Is there? She looked at him. Yes, there is. He nodded once, accepting that. Tomas left before noon. Reluctantly, his shoulders set. He promised nothing, but he looked back twice before his horse carried him out of sight, and Marin thought that might mean something eventually. She spent the afternoon going through her father's desk while Rafe worked on the bunkhouse roof. He had found a section of bad shingles on the northwest corner, and the freeze-thaw cycle had opened up gaps that would ruin the interior by spring if they were left. She could hear the hammer. At some point in the mid-afternoon, a boy arrived with the supply sacks from town. 12 years old or so, too thin for the cold, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned early to read a room before walking into it. Caleb Fenn, she knew him, vaguely. He slept in the livery loft and ran errands for a meal. He set the sacks down in the yard and was turning to go when Rafe came down from the roof. That halter's cracked through, Rafe said, nodding at the bridle. Caleb had slung over one shoulder. The boy stopped. It's not mine. Whose is it? Livery. They'll just throw it out. Rafe took the halter, examined the brake, and sat down on the mounting block with his knife and a length of spare leather. Come here. I'll show you how to splice it so it'll hold longer than a new one. Caleb hesitated. Then he came. He stood beside Rafe and watched, and Rafe talked through what he was doing without talking down to him. Marin watched from the doorway. The boy was good with his hands, she noticed. He picked up the technique fast and tried the second, splice himself, without being told to. Then Caleb looked up and saw the feed sacks inside the open shed. He went very still. Something wrong? Marin asked. Caleb looked at the sacks, then at Rafe, then at the ground. No, ma'am. She let it sit. But she moved the sacks to the back of the shed after he left and noted which ones had come from which supplier. Calvin's message arrived with the afternoon mail run. She read it once, folded it in half, and put it on the table. Merritt is willing to discuss a fair price. A fresh start somewhere else would serve you better. Please consider it. Rafe came in for supper and saw the note. He didn't pick it up or ask. She told him anyway, because he had a right to know what they were dealing with. He'll escalate if you don't respond, Rafe said. I know. That's not a reason to respond. I know that too. She served the meal. Beans, cornbread, dried apple, not much, but she hadn't asked for help, and he didn't comment on it. He had built up the kitchen fire before she asked, which she noticed. He cleaned up after himself. She noticed that too. It was late in the evening when she saw the winter coat on the chair by the door. His coat. She picked it up to hang it and felt the torn lining on the inside, a long split along the back seam where the stitching had let go. Without thinking about it much, she threaded a needle and sat by the lamp and sewed it closed. She was halfway through when she caught herself and stopped. She finished it anyway. Left it on the chair. Merritt came the next morning with a man she didn't recognize. who carried a leather satchel and a clipboard and introduced himself as an association inspector. She stood on the porch. "Miss Holt," Merritt put on his patient expression, "we're required to inspect any livestock under a health concern. You understand? This protects you as much as it protects anyone. Then I'm sure you won't mind showing me the formal complaint that triggered the inspection." Merritt smiled. "These are standard procedures. Show me the complaint, or I'll have Sheriff Reed here before noon." The inspector looked at his clipboard. Merritt looked at Marin. She permitted visual inspection through the fence. She walked every step with them, answered questions with facts and no elaboration, and refused to let them inside the feed shed or the foaling barn. When the inspector tried to suggest that two of the mares showed signs of a communicable respiratory illness, she asked him to specify the exact illness, its known vectors, and the last documented outbreak in eastern Oregon. He couldn't. "Then we have nothing further to discuss today," she said. "If you develop a more specific concern, I'm happy to speak with an actual veterinarian." Merritt paused on his way out. "Resistance only makes the town suspicious, Marin. You know that. I know what you're doing," she said, "and I know you know I know. So let's not waste each other's time pretending." He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he touched his hat and left. Rafe was leaning against the barn wall behind her. He hadn't inserted himself. He hadn't stepped up beside her or spoken. He had simply been there, and she was aware, distantly, that the inspector had been aware of him too, which had probably shortened the visit by 20 minutes. "You handled that well," he said. "I've been watching him operate for years." She turned back toward the barn. "I know exactly how much air is in those words." That night, she took samples from every remaining feed sack and stored them in clean glass jars under the floorboard at the back of the pantry. If Merritt sent someone to remove them, they wouldn't find all of them. Rafe placed 2 lengths of horsehair across each gate. He tied them low and tight, invisible in the dark. He told her what he'd done and why, and she listened without commenting, and then she went back to work. At midnight, she heard him step outside. She listened from her bedroom window. She heard him check the east gate, then the north, moving quiet across the frozen yard. Then silence for a long moment. Then he called out, short, sharp. A single shot cracked across the dark. Something metallic rang the water trough. She was out the door in her boots and coat before the echo died. Rafe stood at the north gate, looking out toward the ridge. The horsehair had been broken. The trough was leaking from a hole in the upper rim. Above them on the ridge, someone stood dark against the darker sky, still, watching. Then the figure turned and was gone. Rafe didn't move to chase. He looked at the trough, then at the ridge, then at her. "He wants you to see him," she said. "Yes, to make sure I know there's always someone watching." Rafe said nothing for a moment. "We'll fix the trough in the morning. I'll keep the fire in the bunkhouse low, so there's no light coming from that side of the yard." He paused. "We should keep the lead horses in the south barn for now." She nodded. She was cold, and she was angry, and she was tired, and she didn't trust herself to say anything useful, so she went back inside. She lay down on top of her bed, without sleeping, for a long time, listening to the wind. The bullet had punched through the upper rim of the trough at an angle, which told Rafe it hadn't been fired to hit the trough. It had been aimed to hit the seal on the small container fitted inside it. He found the container wedged beneath a false ledge of stone, just under the waterline, probably placed there in the last week, while the trough sat unused in the cold. It was copper, sealed tight, about the length of a boot. The bullet had split the lid and released whatever was inside into the water, a dark, oily liquid, already thinning in the ice melt. "Stop the horses," Marin said from behind him. She was already moving, already opening the south pasture gate and turning the mares away before any of them reached the trough. 3 horses were close. She got them turned with her arms out and her voice low. No running, no sharp movements. She placed herself between them and the trough like it was the most natural thing. Rafe pulled the container free and smelled it. He recognized it, not from a book, from a drive, years ago through alkaline country, where a stand of range plants had been concentrated by a dry summer. He'd seen one horse die from that smell. Young gelding took 2 days. He said nothing about how he knew. This isn't an illness, Maren said. She was looking at the water, at the dark swirl moving in the cold current. No, it's a mixture. Plant-based. She picked up a small stick and touched the surface of the water, then smelled the stick. There's something else in it. Something refined. Concentrated, he said. She looked at him. To make it faster, he added, and harder to trace. They dismantled the entire watering system that morning. Every pipe, every junction, every trough and pan in the eastern and northern pastures. They flushed everything they could flush and replaced what they couldn't, and it took until almost noon. The mare went into labor at 1:30. Not Solstice, a bay named Real, young, second foal. She'd been showing signs since morning, but Maren hadn't wanted to say it aloud while they were still fixing the water system. Saying things too early made them heavier somehow. She knew what to do. She'd helped her father with births since she was old enough to hold a lamp. She went in calm, settled herself in the straw, and started talking Real through it. Right here, she said. Right here with you. Come on, girl. Rafe stood at the stall door. He didn't come in unless she told him to. Hold her head, Maren said. Gentle, don't pull. He came in and did exactly that. Quiet, patient. When Real shifted and pressed her weight sideways, he moved with her without fighting it. The foal came in under 2 hours. Small, dark bay, all legs, shaking in the cold straw. Maren cleared its face and stepped back and let the mother do the rest. She stood up slowly. Her back ached and her knees were wet. Rafe was watching the foal. He had the particular stillness of someone seeing something they don't take for granted. Second foal? He asked. Her second. Easier than the first, which says something for her. He nodded. Outside, Solstice had pressed her nose against the barn wall, tracking the sounds from inside. Maren went out to her, and the mare paced, restless. Maren pulled her father's brass whistle from her coat pocket, small, worn smooth at the mouthpiece, and blew 3 short notes. It wasn't loud, it wasn't supposed to be loud, but every mare in the south pasture lifted her head. Solstice went still. Within 2 minutes, 6 horses had moved to within 20 feet of the barn door, standing easy, ears forward. Rafe came out and stopped. He looked at the horses. He looked at Maren. He looked at the whistle. My father started it, she said. It took 3 years to train the first group, all the way through. Sounds feel different to a horse than commands. Less like pressure. She tucked the whistle away. Daniel helped with the second generation. Rafe didn't speak for a moment. I've never seen anything like that, he said. He said it, plainly, without elaboration, the way someone says something when they mean it, and don't feel the need to make it bigger. She looked at him. It's not a trick. It's repetition and patience, and knowing what an animal is afraid of before you try to teach it anything. I know, he said. That's why I've never seen anything like it. She went back inside to check on the foal. They went to town in the early afternoon because the feed needed examining, and she wanted to see the remaining freight sacks before someone moved them. Hester Quill met them on the boardwalk outside the general store. Hester was 61 and had sharp gray eyes and no patience for anything she considered a performance. She had lived in Sagebrush Wells longer than most of the current residents, and she remembered things with the accuracy of someone who had learned early that memory is a form of protection. I saw him, she said without preamble. Merritt Voss. He spoke with Calvin outside the courthouse the morning before the wedding. 15 minutes at least. Calvin came away with a paper freight note, looked like folded into his coat. Did you hear anything? Maren asked. No, but I know what a man looks like when he's been told what he's going to do. Hester paused. Calvin had that look. Inside the store, the general store owner was cooperative in the careful way of a man who doesn't want trouble and is not going to commit to anything. He confirmed the feed order. He confirmed the delivery time. He denied any knowledge of what was in the sacks. Marin believed the denial. The man was frightened, not guilty. Rafe examined sacks stacked in the back storeroom. He worked slowly, turning each one, running his fingers along the seams. At the fourth sack, he stopped. "Look at this." Marin came over. He held the sack up to the window light. Along the bottom seam, she could see it, the original stitching, and over it, a second layer, slightly different thread, a slightly different color. She pulled at the second layer carefully. Beneath it, stamped on the burlap in faded black ink, was a V inside a partial circle. Voss freight. The original sack had been restitched to hide the stamp. "They transferred the contents," she said, "or they transferred the sacks and refilled them." Rafe set it down. Either way, someone with access to Voss freight did this after the original order was placed. They found Calvin at the Rusk freight yard. He was supervising a load of dry goods being packed onto 2 wagons, and he stopped when he saw them, and the blood went out of his face in a way that told Marin everything she needed to know about what he knew. "I didn't load those sacks," he said, before she could speak. "I want you to know where they loaded," she asked. "I don't know. I wasn't there." "Who was?" He looked at the ground. "Calvin." "I don't know who was there," he said. "I was told the feed had arrived and been stored. I signed the delivery order because it was already paid for and it was supposed to be—" He stopped. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" He didn't answer. She studied him. He wasn't lying about that part. He was scared, which was different. Caleb appeared around the side of the freight building. He had a broom he wasn't using, and he'd clearly been standing there for at least part of the conversation. "The sacks came in after midnight," Caleb said. Everyone looked at him. He kept his eyes down. "I was in the loft. I heard the wagon. It came in around 1 in the morning. 2 men. They moved sacks from a Voss wagon into the Holt order. I couldn't see their faces." He gripped the broom handle. "I couldn't see their faces," he said again. Calvin's throat moved. "Who told you the feed had been stored?" Rafe asked him quietly. Calvin said nothing. "Someone gave you that information," Rafe said. "Someone who knew when the sacks were moved, because they arranged it." He paused. "Was it Merritt, or was it someone who works for him?" Calvin turned and walked back toward the wagons. Marin let him go. The foal was in the freight corral. She saw it on the way out. She wouldn't have noticed if not for the angle of the afternoon light catching the jaw and the particular crescent-shaped mark under the chin, dark against the pale coat. She stopped walking. Rafe stopped beside her. "That's a Holt foal," she said. The brand on the hip had been worked, not blotched. Whoever had done it was careful. But she'd been at the birth of this animal. She knew that mark under the jaw the same way she'd know her own scar. "Someone's been selecting animals," she said. "They're not just trying to destroy the herd. They want specific horses." Rafe said nothing, but his jaw was tight. She opened the corral gate and led the foal out. A Voss rider on the far side of the street called out, "Hey, that's under association custody." "This is a Holt foal," Marin said. She kept walking. "Send Merritt a letter?" She didn't stop. "Tell him I'll discuss the brand at a formal inspection with the county recorder present." Rafe positioned himself behind her and slightly to the right, where the rider could see him clearly without any drama being made of it. The rider stayed where he was. She walked the foal back to the wagon and put him in beside Reel's blanket, which still had the mare's smell. The foal settled. She climbed onto the wagon seat. Down the street, she could see the rider speaking to another man, both of them looking her direction. "Merritt will file a complaint tonight," she said. "Probably." Rafe untied the lead horse. "He'll say you took disputed livestock. Let him." Rafe climbed up and picked up the lines. "You know that makes the inspection harder." "I know." She looked straight down the road. "I wasn't going to leave him there." Rafe clicked the horse forward. He didn't say anything else about it. They were a mile out of town when he said, almost to himself, "You understand those animals better than anyone I've seen handle them." She glanced at him. "I don't mean it like a surprise," he added. She turned back to the road. "I know you don't. That's the only reason I'm not annoyed by it." He smiled. just slightly. She didn't see it, but she heard something change in his breathing that might have been a laugh held in. Tomas was waiting when they got back. He was standing just inside the gate, and his face was carrying something heavy. He saw Rafe. He looked at him for a long moment, the way someone looks when they're placing a face they've seen before but can't locate. Then it landed. "You were Calder's trail boss," Tomas said, when Daniel Holt died. Marin heard it from the doorway. She stood very still. Rafe didn't deny it. He didn't look away. He stood in the yard in the late gray light, with his hands loose at his sides, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that would change the shape of what Tomas had just said. And Marin heard every word. Nobody moved for a long moment. The yard quiet except for the wind coming down off the ridge and the sound of reels foal shifting in the barn behind them. Marin stepped down from the doorway. "Go inside, Tomas," she said. Tomas looked at her, then at Rafe. Then he went. She stood in front of Rafe and waited until she heard the kitchen door close. "Tell me," she said. Rafe took his hat off. He held it at his side. He didn't look for a comfortable way to start. "Spring of 1880, he said. "I was bossing a drive for Merritt Voss, 200 horses moving north through the canyon country. East of here, the Black Rock crossing." He paused. We'd had 3 weeks of hard rain. The canyon was running fast. I looked at it and told Merritt we needed 2 days to wait it out. And he told me the buyer in Pendleton had a deadline, government contract. Every day late cost him money. Rafe looked at the ground, then back up. "He ordered me to take them through." Marin said nothing. I objected. He reminded me that I was the trail boss, that the decision was mine to execute and his to make. His voice didn't change pitch. He was just saying it, the way you say something you've said in your own head 1,000 times. I obeyed. I took them in. "And Daniel, your brother was riding left flank. The water came up faster than we expected. 2 young hands got the horses tangled in debris about 100 yards in. Rafe stopped. Daniel went back for them. He freed both of them, got them to the bank. He stopped again. The current took him before he could make it himself." Marin stood very still. "We recovered him 2 days later," Rafe said, "downstream." The wind moved through the yard. A horse shifted in the south barn. "Why are you here?" Her voice was controlled. "Why, of all the ranches in Oregon, did you stop in Sagebrush Wells?" "I came through with a freight load, that part's true. But I knew the name. I've known the Holt name for 7 years. He looked at her steadily. "When I saw Merritt at that church, doing to you exactly what he did to ranchers, before those drives, the isolation, the pressure, the manufactured emergency, I made a decision to stay. Without telling me who you were, yes. Without telling me that you were there when my brother died, yes." She turned away from him. She walked 6 paces toward the fence and stood there with her back to him, looking out at the pasture. The mares were quiet in the late light. Solstice stood at the far end, watching her. "You said you'd made a decision you've regretted every day," she said. "In the kitchen that first morning. I thought you meant coming here." "I meant the crossing." She turned around. "I want to know why you never came to this ranch after. Why you never told my father." Something moved across Rafe's face. Merritt told the surviving crew that if they spoke to anyone about what caused the flood drive, if any of us pointed to his order, he'd see us charged with reckless endangerment of the herd, and the hands criminal liability. He set his jaw. 3 of those riders were 19 years old. First drives. I believed him. "So you protected them by staying silent." That's what I told myself. Is that what it was? He was quiet for a moment. "Partly, and partly I couldn't face coming here." Tomas came out of the kitchen door. "There's something you both need to hear," he said, "but I'll wait until you're finished." Neither Marin nor Rafe spoke. "I'm not finished," Marin said finally. "But say what you came to say." Tomas had confirmed what Rafe couldn't prove alone. The surviving hands from that drive, Tomas knew 2 of them, had received cash payments from Merritt in the months following Daniel's death. Not much. Enough to move on and stay quiet. One of them had told Tomas, years later, over a winter fire that Merritt had threatened them so specifically, with so many details about their families and their debts, that they'd believed every word. He's done it before and since, Tomas said. Every time something goes wrong on a drive he ordered, it gets reassigned. The boss takes it. The hands take it. Merritt stands clear. Rafe accepted this without expression. Tomas watched him. The way you watch someone you aren't sure yet is trustworthy. Marin sat at the kitchen table and didn't look at either of them. You can stay, she said to Rafe, until the horses recover and we know the ranch is stable. That was the agreement. She looked up. After that, we'll see. That's fair, Rafe had said. Tomas left at dusk, reluctant, looking back twice. He said he'd find out what he could about the freight routes. Marin didn't speak to Rafe again that evening. The fence went down sometime in the night. Not a clean break. Someone had cut 3 of the 4 wires on the northern section, leaving the top one intact to make it look whole from a distance in the dark. The mares found the gap before Marin did. By the time she heard them moving wrong and got her boots on, 6 horses had pushed through and were already a quarter-mile up the Widow's Notch Trail. She went after them on solstice. Rafe was already on his horse by the time she cleared the barn. She didn't tell him to come, and she didn't tell him to stay. He came. The trail up to Widow's Notch was bad in daylight and worse in freezing rain, which had started sometime in the last hour. Ice on the rock face, mud below that, the whole surface moving under the horse's hooves in a way that required constant attention. She'd ridden this trail her whole life, and still she moved carefully, leaning into the slope, giving Solstice her head where the footing was worst. Rafe stayed close behind. He didn't crowd her horse. When a stretch of iced rock required them to dismount and lead on foot, he was already off before she called it. They caught up to the mares in a flat bowl below the first ridge. The horses had bunched up, nervous, not sure of the terrain in the dark. Marin came in, slow and quiet, and let them smell her before she got close. She moved them with her voice and her position, blocking angles, redirecting momentum, and within 20 minutes they were turned back down the trail. It was on the way back that she smelled the smoke. She saw the orange glow from the last bend above the ranch, the hay shed. She pushed the mares faster than was safe on the wet trail and nearly lost her footing on the last switchback. When she came into the yard, the shed's east wall was fully involved. Rafe was already off his horse, already pulling feed sacks away from the south side where the fire hadn't reached. They worked without speaking. There was nothing to say. She soaked her jacket in the water tank and beat back the edge of the fire while he moved everything salvageable to the center of the yard. The water in the secondary trough was low. Whoever did this had planned for that too, she realized, and they lost the east wall and the roof before the fire ran out of fuel. When it was done, she stood in the mud and looked at what was left, maybe a third of the winter hay. The metal tools, which fire doesn't take, the saddle frames, which she'd managed to drag out early. Rafe came to stand beside her. A burning beam had shifted in the last minutes, when they were both still close, and he'd stepped in front of it without thinking. He had a burn along his left shoulder inside the collar. She'd seen it happen. Sit down, she said. I'm fine. You have a burn on your shoulder. Sit down. He sat on the mounting block. She got clean cloth from the house, and the salve her father had made beeswax and dried calendula, the same formula he'd used on every ranch burn for 30 years, and she came back and put it on the burn without asking his permission. He didn't flinch, but he was very still in a way that had nothing to do with pain management. She tied the cloth in place and stepped back. I would have told you, he said, about Daniel. I came here meaning to tell you. He stopped. You wanted to be useful first, she said, so I wouldn't throw you off before you could help. He didn't deny it. That's the same as hiding it, she said. Whatever your reason, I know. She picked up the cloth scraps and went back inside. She found it an hour later when she was sifting through the ash at the back of the shed. Metal, rectangular. About 2 inches long, with a raised mark on the face. She cleaned it on her coat and held it to the lantern. A wagon identification tag. Merritt's freight company used them on their supply rigs. She'd seen them on the wagons at the Stock Association yard. This one had partially melted, but the first three letters of the Voss stamp were still readable. She closed her hand around it. The sabotage was no longer suspected. It was documented. Whoever set this fire had come from a Voss wagon, and they'd been careless. Or they'd been rushed, or they hadn't expected her to look carefully through what burned. She didn't tell Rafe that night. She went inside and put the tag in the jar with the feed samples, and went to bed and lay there listening to the wind. He had cost her something by hiding who he was. She understood his reasons. She didn't forgive them yet because understanding and forgiving are two different operations, and she was too tired and too angry to do both at once. But she thought about Tomas's face when he confirmed what Merritt had done to the hands. She thought about what it would mean to carry 7 years of that. She didn't soften on it, but she thought about it. The next day, Caleb didn't come back. He was supposed to deliver a message to the feed merchant in the afternoon. The livery owner sent word by supper that the boy had never returned from the errand. His cap was gone. His blanket was still in the loft. Marin went to the north gate at last light to check the mail post. The cap was in the mud just inside the gate, pressed down like someone had stepped on it, or like someone had dropped it while being moved fast. Above it, on the second wire of the fence, tied tight around the post, with a small, careful knot, a narrow strip of red ribbon, her ribbon, from the bonnet. From the wedding day, she stood in the cold and looked at it. He must have taken it from Hester's sewing basket. He would have known she'd recognize the color. 13 years old, taken by men twice his size, and he'd thought clearly enough to leave a marker. She untied it from the wire. Her hand wasn't shaking. She made sure of that. She walked back to the house and opened the door and looked at Rafe. "Caleb's gone," she said, "and he left us a trail." Marin showed him the ribbon. Rafe looked at it for a moment. He planned it in her fingers. Hester's sewing basket sits on the table at the boarding house. Anyone who's been in there knows it. He took pieces before they moved him, or he got free for a minute and used what he had. Smart kid. Yes. She folded the ribbon into her shirt pocket. "We leave at first light." "Both of us." Rafe didn't argue. He went to the barn and checked the horses and came back with the lamp, and they sat at the table and laid out what they knew about the widow's notch country. She knew it better than he did. She drew it from memory on the back of an old feed receipt. The main trail, the two branches, the abandoned line shack her father had built for winter riders 20 years ago. If someone wanted to hold a person in that country without being found quickly, the line shack was the obvious choice. No road access. One trail in, high enough up the ridge that you could see anyone coming from half a mile out. She sent word to Tomas before bed. A note slipped under the livery door, where he'd be sure to find it. They left in the gray hour before the sun came up. The spring thaw had been working on the canyon for 2 weeks, and the lower trail through Widow's Notch showed it. Water ran across the path in sheets, shallow but fast, and the rock underneath was unpredictable solid, one step and loose the next. They moved the horses slowly. Marin read the ground, and Rafe watched the ridgeline, and neither of them talked much because the footing required attention. Tomas was waiting at the first switchback, which told her he'd moved faster than she expected. He had 2 ropes coiled on his saddle, and his expression was the face of a man who has decided to stop calculating the cost. "Line shack?" he said. "Line shack," Marin confirmed. The 3 of them moved up. She found the first ribbon marker 30 minutes in, tied to a juniper branch at the second fork. Small, low, placed where a child's hand would naturally reach. She followed the markers without stopping to examine each one, because Caleb had trusted her to be fast about it. The shack sat in a hollow below the upper ridge, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides by old lava walls. The door was new. She could see the fresh nails from 50 yards out, which meant Merritt's men had done work here recently, which meant this place was more than a convenient hideout. They'd prepared it. She pulled up, signaled the others to stop. Two horses tied in the draw below the shack. Two Voss riders, then. She scanned the ridge and found one of them leaning against the rock above the shack, looking north. The second would be inside or close. Marin turned to Rafe and Tomas and kept her voice barely above a breath. I go in from the left, down through the juniper. You two bring the riders away from the door. Don't fire unless it starts first, she paused. Give me 5 minutes. Marin Rafe started. 5 minutes? She said. I know this ground better than either of you. He stopped. He looked at her. Then he nodded. She took Solstice down through the trees in a wide loop, below the sight line of the man on the ridge, and came up on the left side of the shack where the lava wall gave cover. She could hear Rafe and Tomas moving on the main trail, not hiding themselves, giving the riders something to look at. She got to the door. New nails, but the wood was old. The hasp-latch was outside, which meant whoever was inside couldn't open it themselves. She pulled the pin and opened the door. Caleb was on the floor, hands tied in front of him, ankles lashed to the wall ring they'd used to tie horses in winter. He looked up when the light came in, and his whole face changed. Miss Holt, come on. She crossed to him and worked the knots. They were tight, but not complicated. Whoever tied them didn't expect the boy to have tools or help. Are you hurt, my wrists? He held them up. The skin was raw but unbroken. They didn't. They just kept asking me what I'd told you. What did you say? Nothing. I told them I was just a stable boy. She got his ankles free and pulled him up. Outside, she could hear raised voices, Tomas, from the sound of it, confident and deliberate, holding someone's attention. She got Caleb to the door and looked out. The rider on the ridge had come down. He and the second man were both facing Rafe and Tomas on the trail. Rafe had positioned his horse across the narrow path, so neither rider could move past him without physical confrontation. Run to Solstice, she told Caleb. Don't call out, he ran. She followed, and they were both behind the lava wall before the second rider turned around. Then the canyon shifted. She heard it before she felt it. A low sound from upstream, like a freight train arriving from the wrong direction. The spring thaw had been working on a snow dam somewhere up in the high country, and it chose this moment to let go. Water came around the lower bend in a brown surge, not deep, maybe knee-height on a horse, but fast, carrying branches and gravel, and the cold force of 2 weeks of snowmelt. It took out the lower trail completely. She whistled. 3 notes, short and clear, carrying across the noise of the water. Somewhere across the canyon, on the far side slope, where she'd left the horses as a precaution, she heard Solstice answer. Not a sound, a movement, hooves on rock, coming toward her voice. The trained mares followed. They came through the rushing water at an angle, not straight into the current, picking their way with the calm precision of animals that had been taught to trust the whistle signal over their own fear. Solstice came first, and 2 younger mares behind her, and when they reached the near bank, they stood solid, while Marin helped Caleb up behind her saddle. The 2 Voss riders were stuck on the far bank. Tomas and Rafe came around the upper path. There was a high line above the water, narrow but passable. Rafe's horse made it on the 3rd try. That was when she saw the creek bank. Caleb's foot slipped when Rafe reached down to secure him to the saddle, and Rafe went sideways off his horse, catching the boy, and his leg hit the rock edge wrong. He got Caleb up, got him safe, and then stood with his weight shifted and his face very still, in the way of someone deciding whether to mention a thing. He didn't mention it. She watched him mount again, and she said nothing either. Not yet. They found a shallow lava cave, 200 feet above the waterline, wide enough for the horses, dry enough for the people. The riders below couldn't follow until the surge passed, which would take hours. They sheltered. The cold settled in hard once the adrenaline wore off. Marin got Caleb wrapped in the saddle blankets and gave him the last of the biscuits from her coat pocket. Tomas worked on a small fire, with the dry wood tucked back in the cave, and after 20 minutes, they had enough heat to matter. Rafe sat against the far wall with his legs stretched out. She came over, crouched beside him, looked at the leg without touching it yet. Tell me. It hit the rock edge. Nothing broken. You're sure? Pretty sure. She pressed 2 fingers along the outside of his calf through the denim. He didn't flinch until she reached the upper section. Bruised deep, she said. Maybe a small fracture. You shouldn't ride hard on it tonight. All right. She got a strip of cloth from the inside of her coat, the same coat she'd worn at the wedding, which had been practical, even then, and bound the leg firmly, not tight enough to cut circulation, tight enough to stabilize it. He watched her work. Daniel gave me his compass before he went back. Into the water, Rafe said. She stopped. He handed it to me. Said to look after the 2 boys who were trapped. He paused. I kept that promise. I got them to the bank. But Daniel, he stopped again. She finished the binding. She sat back. He wasn't afraid, Rafe said. That's what I want you to know. He made a choice, and he went back clear-headed. He wasn't dragged in. He chose it. She sat with that for a while. Around them the fire crackled, and the water ran loud below, and Caleb had fallen asleep sitting up, leaning against the cave wall with the blanket pulled to his chin. He would have, she said finally. That was Daniel. Rafe reached inside his coat and held the compass out to her. Brass, worn smooth. A crack in the cover crystal. Her father had given it to Daniel on his 16th birthday. She remembered the morning. She looked at it. She didn't take it yet. You've been carrying it 7 years, she said. Yes. And you couldn't bring it here. No. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Tomas was pretending to be occupied with the horses. My father's death wasn't an accident, she said. She hadn't meant to say it yet, but Caleb had told them something earlier, right before the water came, and she'd been carrying it since. Rafe looked up. Caleb heard one of the riders say that Josiah Holt should have stayed dead after the ridge. She looked at the compass. He discovered the poisoning operation. He must have figured out the pattern, the manufactured outbreaks, the forced sales, and he was going to expose it. Rafe was very still. So Merritt had his men frighten him on the ridge road, she said, and they didn't stop in time, or they didn't mean to stop. She finally took the compass, held it, turned it once in her palm. She didn't cry. She sat with it the way you sit with something true that you've already half known, and you let it settle into the right place in your body where you can carry it forward. After a long time, she looked at Rafe. You're going to tell Reed everything, she said, about Daniel, about Merritt's order, all of it, but not until we have enough that Merritt can't make it look like revenge. Agreed. And we find the freight camp. Caleb said. He heard them mention it. Caleb stirred. He hadn't been fully asleep. Beyond the East Lava Ridge, the boy said, without opening his eyes. That's where they took the sacks. I heard one of them say it. Said the mix was stored there before it went into the feed orders. Marin looked at Rafe. He looked back. Then that's where we go, she said. She let herself breathe then, slow and careful, and she stayed beside Rafe for the rest of the night, not performing anything, not deciding anything beyond the next hour. Just there, in the cold, beside another person who was also awake, which was enough for now. When they got back to Holt Ranch in the gray morning, the official notice was nailed to the gate. She read it without getting off her horse. 48 hours. Surrender every horse for emergency. Quarantine. Below the official language, in a different hand, ink dug hard into the paper, sell, or they all die. She folded the notice and put it in her pocket next to the ribbon. Go rest that leg, she said to Rafe. She rode up to the gate and pulled the notice off the post herself, because it was her gate, and she wasn't going to leave it there for anyone else to see first. Sheriff Amos Reed arrived at Holt Ranch before breakfast. He came alone, which Marin noted. A man executing an order he believed in would have brought deputies. Reed came with his hat in his hands and his horse tied loose, which was the posture of someone who wanted to talk before anything official happened. She met him on the porch. I've seen the notice, she said. I know. He was a big man, Reed, gone soft around the middle, but with a lawman's careful eyes. He'd been sheriff for 11 years. He wasn't corrupt. He was cautious, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. The association filed the quarantine request through the county office. I can't ignore a formal filing, Marin. You know that. What I know is that my horses are being poisoned, not infected, and the man who filed that request is the one doing the poisoning. Reed looked at the gate, at the pasture beyond it. That's a serious accusation. I have samples, feed sacks with the Voss stamp stitched over. A freight tag from the men who burned my hay shed. She let that sit for a moment. I have a 13-year-old boy who watched Merritt's riders transfer sacks into my feed order at midnight. Reed was quiet. I need one day, she said. Give me until tomorrow morning to present what I have. If you still think the quarantine is legitimate after that, I won't fight you on the inspection process. He turned his hat in his hands, slowly. One day, he said. But Marin, if you can't show me something solid, I will. He left without the horses. She spent the morning moving. Tomas went to two of the smaller ranchers south of town, the Peavy brothers, who ran a mixed horse and cattle operation, and a widow named Sable Marsh, who had lost 3 horses to a mysterious illness the previous fall. Marin had a theory about those horses. She wanted confirmation. Both of them said what she expected. The horses had gone sick suddenly. An association inspector had come within 2 days of the first symptoms. Both ranchers had been encouraged to sell the affected animals before the illness spread. Both had done it. The Peavy brothers came back with Tomas. Sable Marsh sent a written statement, 2 pages, careful cursive. She said she'd always thought the timing was wrong, but had been too afraid to say so. Marin put both statements with the samples in the pantry floor. Then Calvin arrived. He knocked at the front door, which told her he wasn't sure of his welcome. She opened it and said nothing, and he took that as permission to come in. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and looked at her with the face of a man who has been rehearsing something. Merritt will pull the quarantine, he said. If you sign the sale agreement, he'll withdraw the filing and leave the ranch inspection records clean. He paused. You'd get enough to start fresh. Somewhere better than this. Better for whom, Marin? There's nothing wrong with this ranch, she said, except the man who's been poisoning it. Calvin set his jaw. He'll destroy it if you don't sell. You know that. He'll take the herd. He'll discredit everything you've said, and you'll end up with nothing. Or, I'll end up with everything, and he'll end up in front of a judge. Calvin looked down. There's something else, he said quietly. There's a warrant. For Calder. He looked up. Old charge. Horse theft. Merritt filed it in 1,880 with the county recorder. He's been sitting on it. She kept her face still. Meaning he'll use it now. He already sent the paperwork to Reed this morning. She let the silence sit for a moment. Did you know about the feed, Calvin? When you signed the delivery order, did you know what was in those sacks? He looked at the table. I knew the timing was wrong. I didn't know what was in them. He paused. I didn't ask. There's a difference between those 2 things, she said. But it's not as big a difference as you'd like. He stood up. He put his hat on. He looked at her with something in his face that might have been the last of his dignity gathering itself together. Take the offer, Marin. Please. No, she said, but thank you for warning me about the warrant. After he left, she stood at the window for a minute. Then she went to find Rafe. He was in the south barn working on a cracked stallboard with his weight kept off his bad leg. He moved carefully, but he moved. She'd told him to rest it, and he'd said he would, which had meant something different to him than it had to her. Reed has a warrant for you, she said. Merritt filed it this morning. Rafe set down the hammer. Horse theft, she said. 1,880. He was quiet. Then 6 horses, from a Voss drive. He claimed I cut them out before the sale settled. The buyer confirmed it on paper. He looked at the stallboard. The buyer was one of Merritt's men, so he manufactured it, the way he manufactures everything. He picked the hammer up again. Reed will have to act on it. He doesn't have a choice. I know. You should take his offer, he said it without looking at her. The sale agreement. You'd get enough to Rafe. He stopped. I'm going to say this once, she said. Merritt Voss killed my father, and poisoned my horses and drove away my hands and pressured my fiancé into leaving me on church steps in the snow. If I sell this ranch to settle his conscience and make his business easier, I'm not starting fresh. I'm letting him win." She paused. "So don't tell me to take the offer. Not you." He looked at her. He didn't say anything else about it. "I'm going to give Tomas authority over the herd while I fight the quarantine filing," she said. "You'll need to tell Reed the truth about the warrant when he comes. Don't make it harder than it already is." "I won't." She turned to go. "Marin," his voice was low. She stopped. "You don't owe me anything. Whatever happens with Reed, whatever you need to do to protect this ranch, I'm not asking you to make it harder for yourself on my account." She stood with her back to him. "That's not your decision to make," she said. "Staying is mine, same as leaving would be." She walked back to the house. Reed came at noon with a deputy and a paper. Rafe came out of the barn himself and met them in the yard. He didn't make them come to him. He looked at the warrant and handed it back and put his wrists out, and the deputy looked at Reed, and Reed looked at Rafe. "I'll want to hear your account," Reed said. "You'll get it," Rafe said. "Everything." They rode out together. Marin watched from the gate. She watched until they were out of sight, and then she went back to work. She went to town with Tomas and the two statements in her coat. She spent 2 hours at the county land office, pulling records. The quarantine filing was thin. The inspector Merritt had brought to her ranch had signed a form listing respiratory symptoms and probable contagion risk, but there was no veterinary certification, no documented case history, no named illness, just a form and a signature. She made notes. Then she went to Hester's boarding house and knocked. Hester opened the door, took one look at her face, and said, "Come in and sit down." They worked at Hester's kitchen table. Hester had her own notes. She'd been keeping them since before the wedding. It turned out dates and names, things she'd seen and heard. Calvin speaking to Merritt. A Voss wagon behind the Rusk yard after midnight. The inspector arriving at 2 ranches within days of their first reported horse sickness. "I'm old enough that people don't notice me watching," Hester said. "That's the one advantage of it." "Will you testify?" Hester didn't hesitate. Yes, they organized everything they had into a sequence. Feed samples, freight tag, Sable Marsh's statement, the Peavy brothers' account, Hester's observations, Caleb's account in Marin's own handwriting. It was enough for Reed to question the quarantine. It wasn't enough to stop Merritt outright. She needed the freight camp. She was on her way back to the horses when Hester called after her. "Wait." Hester went to the back room and came out with something in her hand. She held it out. It was the red ribbon, cleaned and pressed, the torn end resewn with small, neat stitches. "I kept your dress," Hester said. "The part you left. I didn't know what you'd want done with it, but I thought someone should hold on to it." Marin took the ribbon, turned it once. "Thank you," she said. She put it in her pocket, next to the folded notice. She was 2 miles from the ranch when she saw the smoke, orange against the gray afternoon sky, coming from the direction of the east property line. She knew the shape of that smoke before she understood it. She'd grown up watching her father read. Smoke the way some men read weather. The breeding barn. She pushed her horse hard and arrived to find Tomas already there, hauling water in buckets, his face black with ash. The east wall was gone. The roof was partially collapsed. The fire had moved fast, too fast, which meant accelerant, which meant intention. They saved the west section. The stalls on that end, the equipment along the north wall. Everything else was gone, the breeding records. 3 years of careful notation in her father's hand continued in her own. The foaling charts, the bloodline documentation that made the Holt mares worth what they were worth. The specialized equipment she and her father had built together over 2 winters. Solstice was gone, not dead, gone. Her halter post was empty, and the gate behind the barn stood open, and there were tracks in the ash and mud heading east toward the ridge. Marin stood in the middle of the burned yard and looked at what was left. She didn't collapse. She didn't shake. She counted what remained, noted what was salvageable, and made a list in her head of what the cooperative ranchers could loan until spring. Then she went inside and sat at the table and didn't move for 10 minutes. Tomas came in. He sat across from her without speaking. They took Solstice, she said. I know. They burned the records, so I can't prove the bloodline to a buyer. Yes, they're trying to make the herd worthless without her. She looked at her hands. And without the records, any court argument about the horse's value is harder to make. Tomas was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? She looked up. I want to build an alliance. Everyone Merritt has pressured or stolen from or threatened. I want them to know that he's escalating and that staying quiet doesn't protect them anymore. She stood. Will you help me reach them? Yes, Tomas said. All of them I can find. That evening, Merritt's message arrived. A rider left it at the gate without coming to the door. Inside the envelope was Solstice's halter, the leather cut at the throat latch, a dark stain across the cheekpiece. Written on the paper beneath it, sunrise. Sign or I begin the destruction of the remaining herd. Marin looked at the halter for a long time. She put it in the box with the other evidence. Then she went to sleep, because the morning was coming, and she was going to need to be clear-headed for it. The jail in Sagebrush Wells was one room, stone-walled, cold, with a single window too high to see out of, unless you stood on the bunk. Rafe had been in worse places. He'd told Reed most of it the night before. The drive, the flooding canyon, Daniel Holt, Merritt's order, the arrangement that followed. Reed had listened with his hands flat on the desk and his face carefully neutral, the way a lawman listens when he's deciding whether the story is true before he decides what to do with it. He hadn't dismissed it. That was something. Marin came in the morning before the deputy had finished his coffee. She sat across from the cell bars and looked at Rafe with the direct attention she gave to everything. I'm not selling, she said. I know. She reached into her coat and set it on the bench between them. Daniel Holt's brass compass. She'd been carrying it since the cave. You kept it 7 years, she said. He didn't reach for it. He sat on the bunk with his forearms on his knees and looked at it. Daniel handed it to me before he went back in, he said. I told you that. What you didn't tell me is that you've been in Oregon twice since 1880. Tomas confirmed it. You came through this county in 83 and again in 85. She paused. You never came to this ranch. He was quiet. You had his compass, she said. You had 7 years, and you couldn't come here. No. Why? He stood up. He came to the bars not to get close to her, just because sitting still had reached its limit, because I could explain a decision made in a flooded canyon, under an order I should have refused, he said. I could explain that. What I couldn't explain was every day after it. Every day I kept quiet while Merritt walked free, and your father ran this ranch without his son. He looked at the compass on the bench. There's no explanation for that. There's just the fact of it. Marin looked at him for a long moment. You decided what I could bear to know, she said, and what I couldn't. That's what you did. Yes, my father did the same thing after Daniel died. He decided I was too young to hear all of it. She stood. I wasn't, and I'm not now. She picked up the compass and held it through the bars. Take it back. He looked at her hand. I'm not giving it back because you've earned it, she said. I'm giving it back because carrying it is part of your accountability, and you don't get to hand that off to me, to store. He took it. Reed is looking at the inconsistencies in the warrant, she said. Hester went to him this morning with her notes. He may release you temporarily if he can't verify the original complaint. Even temporary gets me out of here long enough to help. That's what I'm hoping. She stepped back. I need you to agree to one thing. What? When you tell Reed the full account, all of it, Merritt's order, the threats to the crew, everything, you do it publicly, at the stockmen's gathering, where Merritt can't quietly make it go away. Rafe looked at her steadily. That's the last thing Merritt has over me, if I say it out loud in front of the whole town. He loses the leverage, she said. Yes, he thought about it not long. All right. She nodded. She turned to go. Marin. She stopped. I'm sorry. Not for the crossing. I've been sorry for that every day for 7 years and saying it doesn't change the canyon. I mean for coming here under false pretenses. For deciding which truths you deserved to know before you could make a fair judgment about me. She stood with her back to him for a moment. I know you are, she said. She walked out. Reed released him 3 hours later. The warrant had two problems. The original complaint named a buyer, who, when Reed checked the county trade records, had purchased horses from a Voss operation 1 month after the alleged theft. The timeline made the accusation structurally implausible, and the second signature on the complaint, a witness Reed had never heard of, matched no records in the county files. Reed presented this to Rafe without apology, which Rafe respected. The warrant's not valid, Reed said. I'm releasing you on my authority, pending the gathering. But I want your word you'll present your account there. You have it, Rafe said. He walked out into the gray afternoon and found Marin and Tomas waiting with horses. They rode back to the ranch. She had been busy. The kitchen table held 3 written statements, a map of Merritt's freight routes, Hester's notes organized by date, the feed samples, and the freight tag from the burned barn. She'd also written out Caleb's account from the cave in clean, careful handwriting and had Caleb sign the bottom of it shaky, unpracticed cursive that looked exactly like what it was. Tomas had reached 4 ranching families. 2 had already sent word back that they'd come to the gathering. 1 wanted written assurance that they wouldn't be blacklisted for attending. The 4th hadn't answered yet. It's not enough to beat him in the association meeting, Marin said. We need him to act badly enough in public that Reed can arrest him on the spot. He'll try to use the quarantine order to move the herd before we can present the evidence, Rafe said. I know. She looked at the map. He'll bring the horses into the stockyard for the inspection. That's the procedure, which means all the affected animals are in one place. Yes, she paused, my horses included. Rafe looked at the map. He'll want to make a show of the inspection. Discredit you publicly while he appears to follow the law. He traced the stockyard layout with one finger. The western fence is old. The posts are shallow. On that end, I noticed it when I rode past in February. Marin looked at him. If he wanted to cause a stampede, Rafe said, that's where I'd start. She was quiet for a moment. He can't kill me publicly. You said so yourself. He needs me to sell voluntarily. He doesn't need to kill you. He needs to make you look reckless, dangerous. If the Holt mares cause a stampede through Main Street, every rancher in the basin will believe the herd is unmanageable. He paused, and you lose the argument. She straightened. He doesn't know about the whistle. No one knows what you can do with those horses except the people in this room. She looked at Tomas. He was watching her with the careful expression of someone putting pieces together. We let him set it up, she said slowly, and we're ready when he does. Rafe nodded. Then we need the evidence visible before it starts, she said. Caleb's account, the sample freight tag. Reed needs to be positioned where he can act immediately. She looked at Rafe, and you need to tell your account before Merritt can call it revenge. Agreed, Tomas said. I'll handle the gate positions during the inspection. I know which of the ranchers will stand firm and which ones will fold if Merritt looks at them wrong. Good, she began organizing the papers into an order. Hester will keep Caleb at the boarding house until we need him. He's not coming anywhere near that stockyard until Merritt's in handcuffs. The 3 of them worked until the fire burned low, sorting, planning, assigning each piece of the problem to the person best positioned to handle it. It was the kind of work that happens when people trust each other's judgment enough to divide a task without arguing about who's in charge. At some point, Rafe went outside to check the horses, and when he came back, Marin was standing at the window. Calvin warned me about the warrant, she said. Yesterday. He didn't have to do that. He's trying to manage his conscience without committing to anything. I know, she turned, but the fact that he came at all means he might be reachable. She paused. If he admits publicly what Merritt threatened him with, it confirms everything. The wedding, the freight transfer, All of it. He won't risk his family's business. Maybe. She looked at the floor. Or maybe there's a point where a man decides that living with what he did becomes more expensive than fixing it. Rafe looked at her. She wasn't talking about Calvin anymore. Or she was talking about Calvin and something else at the same time. He understood both. Marin, his voice came out quiet. She looked up. He'd planned to say something measured, something that acknowledged the distance still between them and the work still ahead and all the reasons this wasn't the moment. I don't want to leave this ranch, he said. When it's over, I want to stay. Not because you need labor, because this is the first place in 7 years that I've wanted a tomorrow to look like today. She was still. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, he said. I know what I've cost you. I'm just saying it, so you have it. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and kissed him. Not a soft moment, not a resolution. She kissed him the way she did everything directly, with her whole attention, and then she stepped back and looked at him with level gray-green eyes. That's not forgiveness, she said, and it's not a promise. I know. Love without truth would just be another kind of abandonment. You need to understand that. I do. She turned back to the table. She picked up the next document and kept working. He stood there for a second, then pulled up a chair and sat down and picked up the page she'd set aside and started reading through it. They worked. Outside, the night was cold and still. Then the ranch bell rang. Not the steady toll that meant a rider arriving. The fast, hard clang that meant trouble, which was the sound Tomas had agreed on. 2 directions, both at once. She was already at the door. He was right behind her. The yard was full of riders. The attack came from the east lane and the north fence simultaneously. 4 men on the east, 2 on the north, moving fast and low. They weren't shooting yet, which meant they wanted something more than destruction. Tomas came around the barn at a run. They're going for the south pasture. They want the herd. Marin turned to Rafe. Get to the south gate, keep them off the mares. She went the other direction. They didn't have time to plan or discuss it. She moved, and he moved, and Tomas moved, and between the 3 of them, they covered the gaps the same way they'd covered the canyon escape by trusting each other to read the ground. Then Calvin appeared. He rode in from the main road, which was unexpected, and for a half-second, everyone in the yard hesitated, because nobody knew which side he was on. He pulled his horse up short, looked at Marin, and said, I didn't know about the poison. I want you to know that. I didn't know what was in those sacks until after. He was breathing hard. He'd ridden fast to get here. Merritt told me the feed was a mineral supplement he'd sourced privately. He said it would improve condition scores before the inspection. Calvin, I'm going to tell Reed what he threatened me with, about the freight routes, the wedding, all of it. He looked at his hands. On the reins, I should have done it months ago. A shot came from the east lane. It hit the ranch bell post, and everyone moved. In the confusion that followed horses, shouting, the dark and the cold, and too many people, in a small yard, Merritt's men captured most of the herd from the south pasture under the authority of the quarantine order, which gave them just enough legal cover to move fast. Rafe was shot. She didn't see it happen. She heard him go down and turned and found him on the ground by the south gate, his hand pressed to his side, Tomas crouching over him. I'm up, Rafe said. He said it to Tomas, but he was looking at her. I'm up. He got up. He was pale and breathing carefully. But he stood. She crossed to him in 3 steps and looked at the wound. Not deep, the ball had grazed the lower ribs, tearing muscle. Bad enough. Not fatal. You need Reed, she said, in the morning. There's still now, she said. You go to Reed now, and you give him the full account. Tonight. While it's fresh, and while Merritt thinks he's winning. She looked at him steadily. That's your part. Let me do mine. He looked at her face. At the determination in it, which was not stubbornness, was something cleaner and harder than stubbornness. All right, he said. Tomas and Calvin helped him to a horse. She watched them go, then turned back to the yard. Caleb was gone. She scanned the area twice. checked the bunkhouse, the barn door, the corner where he'd been keeping himself during the confusion. Gone. She went to the south road. Beside the rut in the mud, a single boot print, small, pointing east, and tied around the spur iron of an abandoned boot, lying 3 feet away, a fresh strip of red ribbon, pointing not toward Merritt's ranch, toward the eastern lava ridge, toward the freight camp. Rafe tried to follow her. He was already half off the horse when Tomas put a hand on his arm and held him there, not forcefully, just steadily, the way you hold something that needs to stay put. She knows that ridge better than either of us, Tomas said. You know that. Rafe looked at the ribbon in Marin's hand, at her face, at the east road. He looked at the wound in his side, which was seeping through the cloth she'd pressed against it. He looked back at her. Let me do mine, she'd said. He let Tomas take him to read. Marin rode east alone. The lava ridge was different at night. She'd crossed it in daylight 100 times, picking horses through the basalt breaks and the shallow draws where the rock crumbled to loose rubble underfoot. In the dark, she moved slower, reading the ground by the sound of her horse's hooves and the feel of the terrain through the saddle. Caleb's ribbon markers were harder to follow without daylight. She found 2 of them by feel, tied low on ironwood branches where his hands could reach. The boy was consistent. She'd give him that. The 3rd marker led her down into the freight camp draw. She smelled it before she saw it. Old canvas, mineral dust, the particular sharp scent she'd identified in the feed samples. It sat in a hollow below the East Ridge face, sheltered on 3 sides a camp that had been used for years, she realized, not months. Long enough for the ground to be packed hard and the fire ring to be blackened deep. A single lantern burned inside the main tent, 1 guard outside, walking a slow circuit. She tied her horse 50 yards back and went in on foot. The guard's circuit took him around the north side of the camp and back in about 4 minutes. She waited for him to complete 1 full pass, then moved on the 2. The tent was larger than she expected. Inside, stacked along the back wall feed sacks, 2 dozen at least, and beside them a row of copper canisters, sealed, the same size as the one that had been hidden in her water trough. On the ground, branding irons, 3 of them, and the heads had been filed to match different ranch stamps. A leather ledger hung from a nail on the tent pole. She opened it. Names, dates, horses purchased after outbreaks, prices paid. The same pattern repeated 16 times across 4 counties and 7 years. Ranchers she recognized, ranchers she didn't. A systematic record of a man who had been doing this for a long time and had kept meticulous notes because he trusted no one to remember the details for him. Josiah Holt's name appeared twice. Both entries crossed out with a single hard line. She heard Solstice before she saw her. The mare was tied in the draw behind the tent. Drugged Marin could tell from the way she stood, too still, head too low, but alive, breathing even. She crossed to her and put a hand on her neck, and the mare's ear came forward slowly. I've got you, Marin said quietly. Come on. She was working the halter knot when the guard came around the wrong side of the tent. He saw her. She saw him. He opened his mouth. She put 2 fingers to her lips and blew 3 short notes. Not the full whistle, no brass, just air, but she'd trained these animals to her voice, and her fingers both, in case she ever lost the whistle. Her father had insisted on it. 2 systems, he'd said, always 2 systems. Solstice lifted her head. Tomas came out of the dark from the north side and put the guard down without a shot, which was the right call given the ridge acoustics. Behind the tent, she could hear 2 horses moving, then 3, then the specific sound of a lead mare changing direction, and others following. She'd left the loose horses from the draw on a long line, positioned where the whistle could reach them. When they heard the call, they moved through the camp in a controlled surge, not a stampede, a deliberate flowing press of animal bodies that separated the second guard from his horse and pushed him into the tent wall. Caleb was in the storage chamber at the back. It was dug into the ridge face, low-ceilinged, secured with a new lock that Tomas broke with a rock while she held the lantern. Caleb came out, blinking. his hair full of dust, his wrists marked from the rope. "The wagon," he said before she could speak. "Miss Holt, there's a false bottom in Merritt's main supply wagon. That's where the rest of the mixture is. I saw them loading it before they brought me here. Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then ride." She pulled one sack of the mineral mixture and the leather ledger. She carried them herself. Behind her, the lantern inside the tent caught the canvas wall, and she didn't go back to put it out, because the sack and the ledger were what mattered, and the camp was already compromised. They were up the ridge before the fire took the tent walls. Most of the written record burned. She knew it, and she kept moving because she had one sack and the ledger and Caleb's account and the people waiting in town. And sometimes what survives is enough. At the jail, Reed sat across from Rafe for 2 hours. Rafe told it straight through. The spring of 1880, the canyon, Merritt's order, Daniel Holt. The arrangement that followed, the false warrant, the 7 years of silence. He named every hand who'd been threatened. He named the buyer who'd signed the false complaint. He didn't soften any part of it, and he didn't ask for anything in exchange. Calvin was brought in at the end and confirmed Merritt's threat against the Rusk freight routes and his instruction to deliver the contaminated feed without asking about its contents. Reed sat with both accounts for a long time. "The stockmen's gathering is tomorrow," Reed said. "Merritt intends to present the seized herd for inspection and have the quarantine order confirmed publicly." "Let him set it up," Rafe said. "Every rancher in the basin will be there. Every one of them has either been affected by this operation or knows someone who has. If he tries to destroy the herd or burn evidence in front of that crowd." "He can't do it quietly," Reed said. "No, and Merritt needs quiet." Rafe paused. "Position your deputies at the stockyard exits before the inspection starts. Don't move on him until he acts. Let him make the choice himself." Reed looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that your public statement tomorrow about the drive, about your role, it changes the warrant picture, but it doesn't erase the accusation entirely. There'll be a formal review." "I know. And you're willing, I'm past willing," Rafe said. "I'm overdue." Marin returned at dawn. She came through the jail door with mud to her knees and Caleb behind her and a feed sack over one shoulder. And she set the sack on Reed's desk and the ledger on top of it and looked at Rafe. He was sitting up, color better, the wound properly dressed by the deputy who had some field medicine experience. She crossed to him and put Daniel's compass in his hand and closed his fingers around it. "After this is done," she said, "we'll decide what it means together." He held it. She turned to Reed. "Tell me you have people positioned." "At first light," Reed said. She nodded. She sat down in the chair across from Rafe and didn't speak for a while. Neither did he. Outside, the town was beginning to move. The sound of boots on boardwalks and horses at the livery, and the particular morning noise of a place that didn't yet know what was coming. They sat in the quiet and let it settle. The stockyard held maybe 200 horses by the time the gathering started. Merritt had moved the seized herd in before sunrise, which told Marin he'd planned his timing carefully. The Holt mares were penned on the west side, nearest the old fence posts she'd noted. The fence Rafe had noted. The fence where the posts were shallow, and the boards had been in the ground too long. She saw the oil slick along the base of the western gate before she saw anything else. It caught the morning light, that particular dark shine on dry wood, and her stomach went cold. He'd prepared it the night before. She found Tomas in the crowd and moved to him without hurrying, because hurrying draws eyes. "West fence," she said quietly. "He's going to light it." Tomas looked. He saw it. "When?" "When the inspection gives him the floor. When every rancher in the basin is watching." She scanned the crowd. Reed's deputies at the 2 east exits. Calvin, near the Stock Association platform, standing apart from Merritt's men, his face carrying the particular look of a man who has made a decision and is living with the weight of it. Hester at the far edge of the crowd, with her arms crossed and her sharp eyes moving. Rafe came up on her left, moving carefully, his coat held close over the dressed wound. He put the Holt mares at the front, she said. I see it. He wants them blamed. An unmanageable herd, dangerous, proof that the quarantine was justified. Can you turn them? She reached into her coat, pulled out the brass whistle. If I can get to the rail before the fire starts. He looked at the distance between them and the western fence. 30 yards, maybe 35, across an open yard full of people. I'll get to Merritt. You get to the rail. Don't kill him. He looked at her. He faces this publicly, she said. That's the whole point. I know. Merritt took the platform at 9 o'clock. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He described the threat of livestock disease with the practiced gravity of a man who has given this speech before. And he was halfway through the part about his obligation to protect the basin's ranchers when the first smoke rose from the western gate. Someone in the crowd called out. The horses nearest the smoke shied, then the ones behind them. The Holt mares were already moving, pressing forward, and the old fence posts began to lean. Marin was already climbing. She went up the stockyard rail on the east side, away from the fire, and stood on the top board with the crowd below her and the panicking herd in front of her, and 200 people watching without understanding what she was doing. She put the whistle to her lips. 3 clear notes, Solstice heard it. The mare's head came up from the middle of the pressing herd, ears forward, and she turned. She turned against the direction of the panic, which is not what horses do, which is not what any animal does, unless it has been trained to place that specific sound above its own fear. The other Holt mares turned with her. And then the untrained horses, following the movement of the animals in front of them, because that is what horses do in a crowd, began to shift. The surge changed direction. It moved away from the western gate, away from the burning fence, eastward toward the open pasture gate that Tomas had positioned 3 ranchers to open at exactly this moment. Marin stayed on the rail. She blew the signal twice more, steady, carrying. Solstice moved through the open gate, and the herd poured after her. Merritt came off the platform fast. He crossed the yard with a gun already in his hand, and his face stripped of the careful expression. And for the first time, the people of Sagebrush Wells saw what had been behind it. He raised the gun toward Marin on the rail. Rafe hit him from the side. They went down together, and Rafe came up with Merritt's gun in his hand, and Merritt face down in the stockyard dirt. He stood over him, breathing hard, the wound pulling, and he held the gun at his side and did not raise it. Stay down, he said. Merritt's foreman threw a lit match at the primary supply wagon. Calvin moved first. He and Caleb together, coming from opposite sides, released the wagon team before the fire reached the horses. The animals bolted clear. The wagon burned in the middle of the empty yard. Hester's voice cut through the noise. The wagon, she called out. The bottom of that wagon. Caleb was already there. He'd known exactly where to go. He climbed up on the burning wagon frame and found the access panel and pulled it while Tomas broke the latch with a bar iron, and the false bottom came open. The copper canisters, 7 of them, packed tight, the same concentrated mixture that had been in Marin's water supply and her feed sacks. She jumped down from the rail and crossed to the wagon. She held up the sack from the freight camp beside the canister from the wagon bottom and looked at the crowd. This is what's been in your horse's feed, she said. This is the illness. It's not contagious. It's manufactured. She set both down on the platform where the entire crowd could see them. 2 of you lost horses to this last fall. Sable Marsh, Hendrick Peavy. Ask them what their animals' symptoms looked like. Sable Marsh spoke up from the back. Peavy's older brother nodded beside her. Marin kept going. The freight camp east of the lava ridge has been storing this mixture for 7 years. The camp burned last night, but I have a ledger that documents 16 purchases made after manufactured disease outbreaks. She looked directly at the crowd. 16 ranches, 4 counties, 7 years. The yard was very quiet. Rafe straightened beside Merritt. He looked at the crowd. In the spring of 1880, I bossed a drive for Merritt Voss through Black Rock Canyon, he said. His voice carried. The crossing was dangerous. I told him we needed 2 days. He ordered me to take the herd through to meet a delivery deadline. He paused. Daniel Holt died in that crossing. Afterward, Merritt pressured me and the surviving crew to stay silent. I accepted that arrangement because I believed I was protecting young hands from false charges. He looked at Reed. I was wrong to stay silent. Everything I've just said, I'll repeat under oath. Calvin stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He didn't look comfortable. He looked like a man walking into something he can't walk back out of, which is sometimes what doing the right thing looks like. Merritt Voss threatened to close every freight route my family depends on if I went through with my wedding to Marin Holt, he said. He told me to deliver a feed shipment to her ranch without asking about its contents. I did both those things. He stopped. I shouldn't have. Merritt got up from the dirt. He looked at the crowd, at Reed's deputies moving toward him, at the burning wagon, at the open false compartment, at Marin, standing on the platform with his ledger in her hand. He went for Solstice. The mare was standing 20 feet away, calm now, watching Marin. He grabbed her halter and swung up and pulled her head toward the open pasture gate. She didn't move. He kicked her. She stood. From the platform, Marin blew one long note. Solstice turned her head back toward the platform and walked toward it, with Merritt still holding the halter, and then she stopped beside Marin and lowered her head. Merritt dropped off her. He was reaching for the pistol at his back. Reed was closer. Merritt Voss, Reed said, put it on the ground. Merritt looked at Reed, at his 2 deputies, at the crowd, at Rafe, who was standing between him and the gate, with his arms at his sides, and Merritt's own gun still in his right hand, pointed at nothing. Not raised, not threatening, just present. He put it on the ground. Reed arrested him and his foreman both. The hired riders scattered toward the exits and found deputies at each one. The stockyard went very still. Marin stood on the platform with the ledger and the sample sack and Solstice warm beside her. She looked out at the crowd, at faces she'd known her whole life, at people who had called her the reject bride and told her she couldn't run a ranch alone, and at people who had stayed quiet because staying quiet felt safer, and at a few who had done what they could when the cost was high. She didn't make a speech. She climbed down from the platform, checked Solstice's halter, and led the mare toward the eastern pasture, where her herd was grazing in the early sun. That was enough. That was more than enough. Later, when the crowd had thinned, and Reed had his paperwork started, and Caleb was sitting on Hester's boarding house step, eating his second biscuit, Tomas came and stood beside Marin at the pasture rail and didn't say anything for a while. Range foreman pays better than day work, she said. Tomas smiled. I know. You want the job? Yes, he said. I want the job. She looked out at the mares, at the new foals moving among them, at the spring grass just coming through the brown. Good, she said. She went to find Rafe. She found him in the bunkhouse. Saddlebags open on the bunk, his extra shirt folded on top, his patched gloves set beside it. His movements were slow from the wound, careful, but deliberate. She stood in the doorway. You're leaving before you spoke to me, she said. He stopped. He didn't pretend he hadn't heard her. I said I'd stay through the danger, he said. The ranch is safe now. The quarantine will be dismissed. Reed has enough for the charges. He looked at the saddlebags. You don't need a hired stranger on the property. That's not your decision. I know I don't have the right to assume. Rafe. She came into the room. You're doing it again. You're making a decision about what I need without asking me. He turned. She stood 4 feet from him in the cold bunkhouse light, her hair coming loose from its braid, her coat still carrying the ash and mud of the last 48 hours. Leaving without talking to me is the same as every other time you decided what I could bear to know, she said. I thought you understood that. He was quiet for a moment. I do understand it. I was. He stopped. I didn't want gratitude to look like something it isn't. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I'm not grateful, she said. I mean, I am, but that's not what this is. She looked at him steadily. I want to know if you're willing to build something new here, Beside me. Not for me beside me. There's a difference. He looked at her face, at the directness in it that had been there from the church steps. You could run this ranch without me, he said. You know that. I know that, she agreed. I proved it, so did you. She paused. But you told me you don't want tomorrow to look different from today. And I'm telling you that I don't want a future built around, proving I need no one. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to claim anything here. I'm asking if you want to choose it, same as I'm choosing it. He sat down on the bunk, not from weakness, just because he needed a moment to let the weight of it settle properly. I want to stay, he said. I've wanted to stay since that first night in the barn. He looked up at her. I just didn't think I'd earned the right to say it. You haven't earned it, she said. That's not how this works. You choose it and you build toward it. Earning is something else. He stood. Then I'm staying, he said, if you're the one asking. She almost smiled. The 7-day agreement expired months ago. But yes, I'm asking. The days that followed were quieter than anything Holt Ranch had seen in a long time. Reed cleared the false horse theft accusation against Rafe within a week. The warrant, stripped of its false signatures, dissolved on paper review. A formal account of the drive and Daniel's death went into the county record, named correctly, with Merritt's order documented alongside Rafe's role. The record didn't erase the years. It told the truth about them, which is a different and more useful thing. Merritt's property went under investigation. His hired men gave statements in exchange for reduced charges, and each statement confirmed what the ledger had already documented. The cavalry remount contract was suspended pending review, and the contract buyer from Portland discovered he had no clean path to the Holt bloodline. Calvin and his family lost the freight routes Merritt had controlled. That was the consequence of the choices Calvin had made, and it landed squarely on him. He came to the ranch once before spring and spoke to Marin from the gate. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I don't think I've earned that yet either. He held his hat at his side. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, in person. Without asking you for anything, she looked at him for a moment. I heard you, she said, at the stockyard. That took something. Not enough? No, she agreed. But it was a start. He rode away. She didn't call him back, and she didn't watch him leave. Hester arranged for Caleb to attend lessons in town 3 mornings a week. On the 4th morning, Marin offered him a room. She showed it to him, without ceremony, the small room off the hall that had been Daniel's when he was young, cleared out and cleaned, a new quilt on the bed, a shelf along the wall, with enough space for whatever a 13-year-old accumulates over time. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at it. I can earn it, he said carefully. I'm good with horses. I know you are, she said. The room isn't wages. It's just yours, she paused. There'll be plenty of work if you want it, but the room is yours regardless. He looked at the shelf, at the window with the view of the east pasture, at the quilt. All right, he said. That was all. But he put his cap on the shelf that afternoon and came to supper without being called. And by the end of the week, he was first to the barn in the mornings and last to leave in the evenings, and nobody said anything about it, because it was simply the shape of things now. Sable Marsh came first to the cooperative arrangement, then the Peavy brothers, then 2 smaller operations south of town whose owners had lost animals to Merritt's operation and had stayed quiet out of fear. That was now, finally, less expensive than silence. They met at the ranch, 5 or 6 of them, at Marin's kitchen table, and worked out an arrangement that Josiah Holt had sketched in a notebook years ago and never implemented. Shared winter feed. Cooperative access to the Holt bloodline for breeding, a divided cavalry contract that no single operation controlled. When she found his notebook in the desk drawer and read his handwriting across those pages, she understood that preserving her father's legacy didn't mean keeping everything exactly as he'd left it. It meant following the direction he'd been pointed in before Merritt stopped him. She told Rafe that night. He listened, and when she was done, he said, he would have liked this version better. I think so too, she said. Rafe returned Daniel's compass to her on a morning in late April. Formal about it, holding it out the way you hold something you've been carrying a long time. She took it, turned it in her palm. Then she held it back out to him. "Keep it," she said, "until Caleb's old enough to lead his first drive." He looked at her. "He's going to be good," she said. "You can see it already. And he'll need someone to tell him what a compass actually for." She paused. "That's your work, I think." Rafe closed his hand around it. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. On the first morning in May, Marin stood at the rebuilt gate. The new lumber was still bright, not yet weathered to the gray of the old posts. The hinges were set properly. Rafe had spent a full afternoon on them, leveling each one twice. She pulled out the brass whistle. 3 notes, clear and steady, carrying out across the east pasture where the new grass had come up thick and green. Solstice lifted her head from the far end of the field. She turned and came at a walk, unhurried, sure of the ground under her, and the mares came with her, and behind them the foals born this spring, testing their legs, curious about everything. Rafe was at the gate post with a wrench, tightening the final hinge. Caleb came around the barn with a load of fresh boards, carrying them efficiently, balanced, already moving, like someone who knows ranch work in his body. Above the gate, tied to the top rail where the wind could take it, the red ribbon moved in the morning air. Not the symbol of a rejected bride, not the mark of a woman who couldn't manage alone, just a ribbon, red as choice, tied to the home she had fought for, and built and decided to share. Solstice came to the gate and stood. Marin put her hand on the mare's neck. Behind her, she heard Rafe say to Caleb, other end, "You want the weight balanced before you carry it that distance." Caleb adjusted his grip. Marin blew the whistle one more time, soft, just for the foals who were still learning the sound. They lifted their heads. They came. And that is where we leave Marin Holt standing at a gate she fought for, whistle in hand, ribbon in the wind, and a man beside her who chose to stay, not because she needed him to, but because she asked him to. 2 very different things. I've been writing Western stories for a long time. I've written outlaws and lawmen, droughts and stampedes, homesteaders who lost everything and rebuilt from ash. But the stories that stay with people, the ones that get passed around, talked about, argued over, they're never really about the land. They're about what people decide to do when the ground shifts under them. Marin's story is one of those. When Calvin walked out of that church, the town read it one way. They saw a woman who had been judged and found wanting. They saw someone diminished. What they missed, what most people miss when they're watching someone fall, is that how a person rises from that moment tells you everything about who they actually are. Marin didn't collapse on those church steps. She pulled the ribbon from her bonnet, folded it once, put it in her pocket, and walked forward. That single action contains the whole story. She didn't perform strength for the crowd. She simply didn't stop. There's a lesson in that worth sitting with. The people who told Marin she couldn't run a ranch alone weren't entirely wrong about the difficulty of what she faced. They were wrong about what difficulty means. Hard isn't the same as impossible. Needing help isn't the same as being incapable. Marin needed Rafe. She needed Tomas. She needed Hester and Caleb, and eventually even the reluctant honesty of Calvin Rusk. None of that made her weak. It made her someone who knew how to build something real, because real things are never built alone. Rafe's arc carries its own weight. He spent 7 years convinced that staying close to people was a form of danger, that the best thing he could offer anyone was a clean departure. He'd confused punishment with protection. He thought, if he kept moving, kept refusing to put down roots, he was somehow honoring the guilt he carried. What he was actually doing was letting Merritt Voss control him from a distance without ever having to say another word. Shame does that. It doesn't need a villain in the room to keep working on you. It's self-sustaining, as long as you keep feeding it with silence. What broke that cycle wasn't absolution. Nobody handed Rafe forgiveness on a plate. What broke it was the decision to tell the truth out loud, in public, with consequences attached, and then to stay and face what came next. That's the only thing that actually works against that kind of carried guilt. Not running, not one more carefully managed departure. Just the truth, spoken where it can't be taken back. And then there's the ribbon. That red ribbon moves through this story like a thread connecting everything. It starts as humiliation, a symbol of a public rejection, something to be discarded. But Marin doesn't discard it. She folds it. She keeps it. And without planning to, without any grand gesture, it becomes something else entirely. A signal, a marker, a bandage, a warning, a promise. The same object changed entirely by what the people who carry it decide to do next. That's not an accident of plot. That's the point of the whole story. The meaning of what happens to us isn't fixed. We get to keep deciding what it becomes. If you took anything from Marin and Rafe's story, I hope it's this. Independence and partnership are not opposites. Choosing to let someone stand beside you, really choosing it freely, with full knowledge of who they are and what it will cost, that's not surrender. That's the bravest thing a person can do after they've learned how badly trust can go wrong. Marin could run the ranch alone. She proved it. She proved it so completely that by the time she asked Rafe to stay, nobody in Sagebrush Wells could argue otherwise. And that's exactly why her choice meant something. It wasn't made from need. It was made from strength. That's the kind of love worth writing about. The kind worth reading about, too. Thank you for spending this time out on the high desert with me. If this story stayed with you the way I hope it did, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And I'll see you at the next one. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.